Every time I try to start this recording, my big old Labrador starts walking around with his big old clunky feet on this plywood floor, and it makes a lot of racket, but I thought he had gone out, but he's coming back in. Good day, mates. Today we have Australian Yowie stories. This whole video is all Australian stories. These guys know how to write. They have an animal on that big, giant, huge island in the Pacific Ocean that's just like our North American Bigfoot, I think. All right, here we go. All right, Australian stories. Let's jump into the first one. The first email I'm going to share with you, and it's my first Australian Yowie story, is from Carl, and he writes, "Before I get into my experience, my name is Carl, and I'm from Gold Coast, Queensland, Australia. My father is Papua New Guinean Torres Strait Islander. We are descendants from headhunters and cannibals, and I still have some of the traditional weapons and headdresses. My father used to tell my brothers and I all these stories of the red-haired wild men. They were huge men covered in hair that lived in the bush. They roamed the highlands and the mountains at night, eating who they caught." And then Carl goes into one story that he was told when he was a kid. I'm not going to share that with you now because they're fables. They're stories that parents would tell children to coax them into behaving and being good little children. And it's pretty scary. And I don't want to scare any of the children who listen to this channel. But he goes on to write, "This story has stuck with me my entire life. It has also been the reason for a few sudden awakenings in the middle of the night. In Australia, where there are few cities and towns, but even a country that is such as large and solitary landmass, almost if not the same size as the United States, but only having a population just shy of 30 million people. That's only about 10% of the United States population. That still leaves a lot of outback, bush, brush, and jungle that has not had human foot set on it. There's also a lot of bush and jungle that is at the city's doorstep as well. I believe for a fact, personally, that there are Yowies out there a lot closer than a lot of people think. Now to move on to my personal experience. One night, my mate and I decided to go fishing. Between him and I, we are a pair of big lads. He comes in at 6'4" roughly, and I'm about 6'2", and we're both over 150 kilos. And we both played rugby league, union, and American football here in Australia." They have American football in Australia? Carl? Really? I had no idea. Back in my 30s, squirrel, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I actually joined a rugby club up in central Kentucky, and I played for a year, and I was horrible at it, but I was in great shape, and I love contact sports. I had played football through high school and loved it, so I wanted to play rugby, and that is where I met the first two Australians I had ever met in my life. These two guys, there were two Australians and two South Africans, and they had come over here on work visas to just experience the United States for 6 months or a year. I don't know how long they were here, but they were the most fun guys that I think I've ever been around. Those guys would work hard all day. I think they worked any kind of construction they could. They worked hard all day. They practiced rugby. That's when we practiced at night, and it was cold. It was freezing cold. But we practiced 4 nights a week. And then we would all go to the pub, and those guys were just laughing and having a great time, and they bought people beers. They were just so happy to be here, and they forever formed my opinion of Australians and South Africans. And anyway, I know I went off on a tangent there, but I've always enjoyed communicating with Australians and the South African people because they're just nice, happy people. They seem to be. I know every culture has its bad apples, but these guys were just happy and they had a good time. Anyway, back to Carl's story. We both spent a lot of time traveling, camping, hunting, and exploring this country. We spent the majority of the night driving up and down the Gold Coast, trying our luck at different spots with lures and bait and only catching small fish to throw back. It was getting late, heading into early morning. We called it a night around 2 a.m. and decided to head back to my mate's place and drop him off. After I dropped him off, I was about to head home, but it was such a beautiful night. The moon was out full and you could see all the stars. The end of summer had passed and the nights were starting to cool down. Still having that itch to catch a decent fish to end the night and actually take a fish home for the missus, I thought, bugger it, a couple more casts won't hurt. I don't know why, but I thought of this little boat ramp dead set at the end of a road in the middle of a scrub would be a great place to catch a decent fish. I get out there and I park in the car park and head down the slight hill to the boat ramp to the water's edge, and I start casting and retrieving my lure. The boat ramp is a little point that went out into the main estuary straight ahead from the ramp. It curled to the right, heading towards the main ocean inlet. To the left was one of the creeks that fed the estuaries, and all up and down the banks were mangroves so thick you wouldn't be able to shine a torch through it. I had been throwing my bait for about 10 minutes or so, enjoying the slight breeze and the calm night, and it occurred to me that the night was too quiet. I began to feel nervous. In all of my years of living in the bush, I learned a long time ago, if you don't think something is right, trust your instincts. While these thoughts raced through my head, I heard a splash in one of the creeks that feeds to the estuary. This creek measures easily 75 to 100 meters across, and at low tide it is still at a depth of 1 to 2 meters. People who are used to the imperial measurement system, every meter is about 3.1 feet, I think. So 2 meters is probably about 7 feet. So listening to the splashing at the moment of water, I start rounding the point to the other side and casting. As I round the point, I stopped, startled at what was crossing the creek. Now originally I thought it was bust-ups from trevs, the trevally fish, chasing bait fish in the creek. But what I saw was no fish. My next thought was it was a big roo crossing. Wrong. This thing was huge, water barely up to its waist. As it's wading across, you could see under the moonlight how big and muscled this thing was. Covered in hair, broad shoulders, and a conical head on them. No neck could be seen. All of this went through my head as the lure went out and landed on the water. Upon that sound, the creature stopped and turned and stared straight at me, like time just stopped. Not a sound could be heard but the thundering of my own heartbeat. For all of these years, telling stories and hearing stories of the wild man, and here I was looking at one. Just like that, time started to speed up. I cranked my reel, winding it in as fast as I could, while watching this mountain of muscle start wading faster, more like starting to run as the water got shallower. It was eating up the meters as it angled toward me. It felt like an eternity trying to get my damn lure in, but eventually I got it in, and without a second thought or even missing a beat, I spun around and took off as fast as I could up the hill. I threw my rod and tackle bag straight into the tub of the ute. Opening the door, hopping in, I turned the ute on, shifted it into drive, and put my foot to the accelerator to the floor. I did burn out up the road as I took off. The whole time I'm flooring it out of there, I kept thinking to myself of all the old stories and that they are true. Even with the blood that flows in my veins and my heritage and my ancestry, I still saw this monstrous being, and I knew it was a Yowie. I knew there was no way in hell that I was fighting this thing and coming out unscathed. As much as I hate to run with my tail between my legs, I didn't care. I was still alive and breathing. To this day I have not been back and never planned to. I live close to Springbrook National Park, the great dividing range that starts near the top of the country and runs all the way to the bottom of the country on the eastern side. Since colonial times, there have been recorded sightings and missing people and unexplained deaths, even in this day and age. I just don't feel the need nor want to come face to face with another one ever. These days, when I head out to the bush, I'm a hell of a lot more alert and aware of my surroundings. Mind you, it still won't help if one of these yowies gets the drop on you. I hope you enjoyed my experience and a little of my family history and traditions. Y'all, I'm sorry, my dog just cannot lay down here. He just walks and paces and walks and paces. Carl, that is unreal. That's unreal. You catch this thing out wading across a creek that's 6 feet deep and the water's only up to its waist. Just about the time you throw a bait and the bait splashes close to it, catches his attention, and then he starts coming at you. Man, I would run too. I can't believe you didn't just drop your fishing rig right there and hightail it to the truck and get out of there. Anyway, that's a great Yowie story. First one I've ever told, and we've got 2 or 3 more in this video, so stand by. Thanks, Carl. Hey, by the way, those 4 guys that I was talking about that I played rugby with, they were the fastest white guys I have ever seen in my life. I could never figure out what they looked like until we went to the pub afterwards because they were so blurry. I mean, they were fast. Fastest guys I've ever seen. Okay, this next email from Australia is from Andy. He says, "Hi, I watched your channel and was interested by the stories that folks have to tell about encounters they have with Bigfoot. You sound like a decent bloke, which was confirmed when I watched another of your videos, and you said you didn't do the vids for donations. I don't take donations, and I did a live video the other day, and people found a way to start donating money, and I was so upset about it that I didn't say thank you to everyone that did that. But you know what? YouTube takes about half of it, so y'all don't do that. Just don't do it. I'm fine. I don't need that. Anyway, I'd like to share an experience that I had as a boy. I'm 57 now, and at the time, I would have been around 15. We lived on a small property owned by my dad, which is now mine, although I don't live there anymore. The property is near Ravenswood in Queensland, Australia. The country was less inhabited in those days, and I spent a lot of time hunting and trapping and camping in my spare time. I had built pig traps around the place and had a pig trap baited with kangaroos. A mate of mine, my brother, and myself camped under a tree up on a ridge about a half a mile from the trap. The plan was to get up at daybreak and check the trap and then go hunting at a location that we called the pig diggings on the property behind ours. Anyway, about 2:30 in the morning, we were getting some misty rain, so we stoked our small fire to keep warm. The tree kept most of the misty rain off, and that's when we heard this ungodly howl coming from where our trap was. I'd been in the bush all my life and have never heard anything like it. We heard it a second time, but this time it sounded a bit closer, so we decided that discretion was the better part than valor, so we headed for the old homestead, which was about a mile away. The third time we heard it, we were about halfway home, and the fourth, we were on the front veranda, and the noise sounded like it was at our camping spot. When we investigated the trap the next morning, we found the gate broken on our trap, and the kangaroos were disturbed. And we put it down to a large pig that we had sighted recently in the area. About a week later, I was hunting by myself and had an old .303 Enfield rifle that Dad had acquired after he got back from the service after the Second World War. I was about 3 miles from home walking through thick bush along a 4-mile creek which was close to some scrub that was a very dense piece of bush. Near the creek, I came across a gum tree about 4 inches thick, snapped off about 7 feet above the ground, and can remember thinking to myself that it was strange because it wasn't rotten, and it didn't have white ants, and none of the other timber in the area was damaged. I moved further towards the bank of the creek when I came across an area where it looked like something had been camped there. The grass was flattened and in some cases sort of trodden away, if that's a word for it, like you'd expect when you use a track for a long time. It didn't smell real fresh, and there were bones scattered around, some reasonably fresh, some older, and I thought I may have stumbled into a dingo's camp or den. Standing in the middle of the area, all of a sudden I realized all the crickets and bush noise had stopped. All was silent, and I got the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, so I chambered around into the old rifle and did a 360-degree, expecting a pig to charge or something. I couldn't see or hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched either. I then left and returned the next day with my brother, but never encountered anything. All was normal, as you would expect. It wasn't until some time later, when I was about 20 years old, that there were reports of a hairy man sighted near Towers Hill at Charters Towers about 50 miles away. My mates and I joked about it at the time and said it was most likely a bloke that we nicknamed Bory, who had a fairly hairy back. I'm sorry. He drove a little Datsun Ute and had a head only his mother could love. I'm sorry, I got tickled. Oh, this is funny. I got to thinking about it a bit and researched a bit about Bigfoot and started to think maybe back then I had an encounter myself. Years later, I found a recording of a Bigfoot near a railway line somewhere, and the howling, or whatever it was, sounded just like what we heard that night while camping under the tree on the ridge. Ravenswood has changed nowadays. They built a big dam on the river and built a bitumen road through the town. A mine opened and the town became populated, and you'd be lucky to see a wild pig these days. Too many townies with guns shooting everything in sight, anyway. Mate, not too exciting compared to some of the other stories that you read, but I thought I'd share it with you. Keep up your videos. I think they're great. Regards, Andy. Andy, every story's important. Every story's important. I catch a lot of flack for that, sometimes in the comments, but I don't care. Because if you take the time to send a story, I'm going to put it in a video as long as I can read it, and this was really well written. These are things that you remember. You're out hunting, you hear these weird noises, I've had things like that, not exactly like that, but things like that happen to me, and they just stick with you. You don't ever forget them, and you may go 20 years and not think about it, but something will jog your memory, and that event will come back into your mind just as clear as you were there yesterday. So I understand all that. I hope your buddy figured out a way to wax his back. I would never wax my back, but you know the real hairy guys, sometimes they do that. Andy, thank you so much for sending that. I really enjoyed it. Man, you're awesome. Thanks, buddy. This last one is another good Australian story. The man wants to keep his name out of it, no problem. He writes, growing up in a semi-rural town in southeast Queensland, Australia, I had heard of a few Yowie stories and read some things, but the topic is generally laughed off as myth or stories that Aboriginal parents tell their kids to keep them from running through the bush at night. Now that I have an interest in the subject, I've come to realize that every Aboriginal tribe has their own word for the large hairy man, and they talk about them like they are as real as anything else that lives in the bush. My father has told me of a night when something large was hanging around their campsite in the bush, not far from the town of Kilcoy, where there is a big Yowie statue on the main street. But the encounter I'd like to share happened on a bright, still summer afternoon 9 years ago. I was in my boat fishing in the upper reaches of Barumba Dam west of Noosa on the Sunshine Coast. There's nothing but thousands of square acres of bush up behind the dam, which borders onto farmland, and thousands of more acres of plantation and hook pine forest. I was drifting along casting lures when I heard a commotion right up on the hillside to my right. Something was crashing through the bush, and it was coming down the hill towards the dam. By the time I got halfway down, I could see some smaller trees shaking as whatever it was went by. As it got closer, I got the feeling that it was actually two animals, as some sounds were coming from a bit further up the slope than others, and the closer it got, the more sure of this I was. I've spent plenty of time in the bush, so I could tell that this was one animal in front of being chased by another larger animal, and they were tearing down the steep, heavily forested slope, coming almost directly towards me. I was standing in the boat approximately 15 meters from the thick water weeds along the shore. Then there are some tall reeds along the water's edge, and then 20 meters of grass growing where the water had dropped down from the dam's full capacity. Past that, the bush started, and it was quite thick with lots of vines and undergrowth along the edge. I stood and watched the undergrowth shake and rattle, and then a large deer came bursting out into the open, absolutely running for its life. I could see the fear on its face, its eyes wide and terrified. It raced down the grassy area and went full pelt through the reeds and into the water and began fighting its way through the water reed. The animal doing the chasing wasn't far behind the deer, maybe 5 or 6 seconds at most. The bush was crashing around as the deer ran towards the water, but just as I was expecting this thing to burst out, it stopped. I'm positive it stopped the second it saw me. If I wasn't there, it would have easily caught the deer as it began fighting through the weeds. This thing stopped right in the tree line and made a deep, raspy, exhaling sound that was unmistakably frustration. There was nothing but a few vines and one small branch obscuring my view. I was in the sun and it was in the shade, but I could clearly make out a large upright animal of at least 6 or 7 foot in height. One arm was up slightly, holding on to a tree beside it, and it looked to be hunched over a bit. The deer was splashing around, but I could hear the thing breathing heavily under the sound in the quiet valley. The deer managed to make its way into open water and proceeded to swim away from the shore. It swam right past my boat, only a few meters from the bow, paying no attention to me at all, and made it across to the other side, where it staggered out of the water on a bit of a rocky area and took off in the same direction. I looked back and the creature was still there watching. I could see its eyes looking right at me. With all the action now over, I had time to process what I was seeing. It was a real heavyweight, this thing. Its shoulders were far broader than the biggest men I've seen, and its head was huge. I couldn't make out much detail of the bottom half of its body at this point, but I could make out the outline. It was almost completely covered in dark brown hair, almost black, but not quite. The hair was fairly long, but looked sleek, like it was in good condition. We stood watching each other for 30 or 40 seconds. I kind of felt like it was sizing me up, but I was confident I could start the engine and drive away if it came at me, so I just sat there and looked at it. I was amazed and said in a loud voice, "Who the hell are you?" And to my surprise, it answered back right away with a deep yarl sound that I'll never forget. I said something else and it started to move off, heading upstream slowly. I could see it walk for 4 or 5 meters before it was out of view, and it walked just like a human. Just before I lost sight of it, I could clearly see 2 legs, and it was using one hand to clear the foliage in front of it. Once it was out of sight, I could hear it walking, and I could hear each footfall. After a minute or so, I didn't hear anything else. It either stopped or made its way into a clearer area. I thought about following it to try to get another look, but I decided to sit down and have a smoke instead. Deer are an introduced species in Australia, but they have thrived along with other feral animals like rabbits, pigs, cats, camels, horses, goats, and foxes, etc., mainly due to there being lots and lots of sparsely populated wilderness with almost no large predators. We have dingoes who are quite capable of taking down large prey in a pack, but that's about it for land predators able to kill a full-grown deer. What I saw was no dingo pack. I've seen them hunt, and they wouldn't have cared if I watched or not. This was a single bipedal creature that seemed to be wary of humans. I've had other experiences with these creatures as well, including one night camping alone with my dog about 150 kilos northeast of the dam, where I feared for my life, but that's a whole other story. I've had food stolen from campsites, sticks and rocks thrown at us while fishing from shore, and other times I felt like we were being watched. This area where all these things take place is very active after dark, and the military have detailed accounts from the nearby training base. I'll never go there alone again. Thanks for letting me share my story. Please keep making your videos. I think they're great. Okay, and he goes on to say a few other things. So, look, to the writer of this email, what a great encounter. I mean, it's like you had a view to this episode, this thing hunting a deer, like you're sitting in a football stadium, and you just get to watch the whole thing, except he made you. He figured out you were there before he busted out into the open. And that tells me these things are pretty smart, and they're really aware of what's going on around them. Then to go on and say that the military there has detailed of accounts of encounters of these things in your area, it's amazing. It's amazing stuff. So thank you so much. Well-written story. I enjoyed it. This has been a really fun video to do. I love reading these Australian stories. I have about 30 of them. I've got plenty to do, full videos on Australian stories in the upcoming weeks, and they're just as interesting or more interesting than the North American Bigfoot. It sounds like almost the same creature. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. I sure appreciate you guys clicking today, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.